It begins, as it has for ages now, with a gentle spring rain in northern Minnesota. Those droplets then join with others as they well out of Lake Itasca to begin a 1,000-mile journey that will take 60 days to reach the sea. Along the way, they will merge into one of the most majestic rivers in the entire world, the mighty Mississippi. Along its banks for 3,000 miles of twisting and turning runs the Great River Road, a highway that wanders through America's heartland. Join us now as we travel along the Great River Road into the American South to discover life along the Mississippi. Imagine a road that stretches from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, a road that follows one of our country's greatest natural resources, one of our most beautiful waterways. Well, there is such a road. This Great River Road mirrors our past and it reflects our traditions because it was along the Mississippi and the road that parallels it that an ingenious people farmed the land long before history was even recorded. Along these dense and tangled banks, a weary Hernando de Soto and his decimated band of Spanish explorers first hacked their way in search of gold and riches. They found instead disaster, death, disappointment. De Soto died in 1542 and was buried in the mile-wide Mississippi, the first white man known to have reached her banks. Over the next 300 years, explorers, trappers, and settlers followed. In the 1860s, America fought its Civil War here. And lately, oil companies have made their fortunes off the river and the land beside it. There is perhaps nowhere else in America so rich in history as here, along the banks of the Mississippi. Life as we know it along the Mississippi began in the 1800s, when most everybody and everything that moved across America moved on the river. It was the golden age of the steamboat, when the South was a vast agricultural belt, supplying food and cotton to the entire world. In the heyday of the steamboat, Cairo, where the Ohio River empties into the Mississippi, was a thriving river town. It's the midpoint of the Mississippi. The place rivermen agree separates the North from the South. This is where filmmakers Linda and Christopher Lewis began their odyssey to explore life along the Mississippi.
Cairo seems an appropriate place to start our photographic journey into the American South. Here, the stately style typical of the North mixes easily with the relaxed informality of the South that lays just downriver.
Just across the levee, large tow barges do battle with the dark waters of the Ohio River, much like the steamboats did a century ago. Not much has changed here.
The Great River Road winds out of Cairo past historic Fort Defiance, established in 1720 on a spit of land where the Ohio and Mississippi converge.
We were quick to discover why the fort wasn't used for long. This spring has been a wet one. The river is already 47 feet and rising, and in what is to be one of the first of many surprises the Mississippi has in store for us on this trip, Fort Defiance is completely underwater.
Flooding can prove challenging to a visitor trying to navigate scenic back roads. But for the people who live here, it can transform a historic landmark into a fishing hole.
The people of the Mississippi Delta are a resilient lot, and they have to be. Mother Nature can be fickle.
In 1993, winter snows and more than twice the average amount of spring rain caused massive flooding along the river. More than 60,000 square miles of land in 9 states were inundated. 12,000 miles of railroad tracks were rendered useless. 7,000 barges were stalled, highways were blocked, and scores of bridges closed. Homes were also washed away.
The Great Flood of 1993 was as serious as America had seen in 100 years. But despite the millions of dollars of damage, there was very little loss of life. It was a far different story during the flood of '27. 70 years ago, there were very few levees on the river, and the ones that were there were woefully inadequate. And greedy cotton planters had left the land eroded and the topsoil depleted. And therefore, when the rains came, there was nothing to hold back the waters. More than once, entire towns were washed away.
We need to hearken back to those days when it was really a very grim situation here in the valley. The river, when it flooded, was capable of spreading out as much as 100 miles wide. These were indeed terrifying times, and huge relief efforts were mounted to help people. Of course, the Great Flood of 1927, which focused so much national attention on the lower Mississippi Valley, we can make a strong case that it's the worst natural disaster in our nation's history. More than 600,000 people were driven from their homes. Half of those had to be housed in refugee camps up and down the river until the water subsided. More than 500 people were killed. Some 25,000 square miles were flooded.
Just off the Great River Road in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the government is waging war with the river. Here at the Waterway Experiment Station, Dr. Michael Robinson chronicles the efforts of engineers who are working to harness the power of Mother Nature.
I think the point needs to be made that the Mississippi is dynamic. It's constantly changing. And what the Corps of Engineers tries to do is to understand those forces and work with the river to reshape it in such a way that it can be a servant of mankind.
Tom Pokrefke uses confetti to test water flow on a large scale model of the Mississippi as it flows past St. Louis.
The confetti we use to evaluate is the plan that we have in there at that particular time. Is it moving the currents in the direction that we feel like they need to be moved? We're looking at kind of a new theory, and we're trying to develop what we call Benway weirs, and there's structures that are submerged 100% of the time, and they help redirect the current and move the sediment around a little bit differently than the way nature does it. And by doing that, hopefully we can get that stable navigation channel.
Hydrologists also use model boats to test locks and dams. In 1991, they were analyzing the design of a new lock near Alton, Illinois.
We'll operate the towboat for a whole range of flows, low flows, high flows, and make sure that the navigation conditions are good. The key in modeling, and one of the emphasis in modeling, is if the wall is 1,200 feet long as you come out of the lock, if it really needs to be 1,400 feet long, the place to find it out is on the model, because if you waited for things to occur in the real world and found out the problem, then it's very expensive. If you're going to make mistakes, you want to make the mistakes on the model. You don't want to do it in the river.
Some rivermen say that these engineers do too much to change the course of nature and may actually cause flooding. On the other hand, scientists point to the 100-year flood of 1993, where things could have been a lot worse.
Does the work done here actually help mankind? According to the scientists in Vicksburg, it does. From Cairo, the Great River Road travels across the Ohio River Bridge into Kentucky. Off to the south, the Ohio and the Mississippi flow side by side for a time, as if neither wants to give way to the other. We are now in the center of a great wildlife refuge that is part of the Mississippi Flyway. For centuries, sheer instinct has brought migrating ducks and geese back to these wetlands as they navigate along the river.
The Great River Road skirts the banks of Reelfoot Lake as it runs south into Tennessee. Reelfoot was formed by the Great New Madrid earthquake of 1811, believed to be the largest quake ever to hit North America.
Its banks are lined with shaded groves and moss-covered trees, offering us a preview of the river further south. As the Mississippi nears Memphis, it is said to resemble the Great Nile Delta in Egypt, and like Cairo, upriver, that is how Memphis got its name. Today, there is even a pyramid here to enhance the comparison.
Time was when Memphis was considered the worst city along the river. Its streets were mere mud paths, Fever raged, and anarchy reigned. Today, however, Memphis beckons the visitors with the spirit of W.C. Handy on Beale Street and the legend of Elvis at Graceland.
South out of Memphis and the Great River Road enters the broad, flat, fertile Mississippi Delta. Here, for centuries, flooding and then the drying of the soil again has made some of the richest agricultural land in the nation. Each spring, when the rains stop, farmers rush to get a start on planting the year's cotton crop, and this year is no exception.
In the South, cotton is king, and it has been, ever since the steamboat gave farmers easy access to markets and money.
It was a total revolution. That and the invention of the cotton gin a few years before really, I guess, is what put the Deep South on its feet economically and made it a booming.
Gordon Cotton has set up office in the old courthouse in Vicksburg, amid reams of public records that tell the dramatic story of the river.
When that first steamboat came down the river, the Nicholas Roosevelt and his steamboat in, 1811, I believe, when it came down the Mississippi, it revolutionized everything. Up until then, people had come down the river, but to get home, they had to go overland. They had to go up the Natchez Trace or something like that on foot or on horseback. This meant that we could also send stuff out of town as well as bring it in, and it was a total revolution.
As early as 1607, planters in the South raised cotton, but hand-picking the lint from the seed took so much time that there was very little profit in it. But in 1793, when Eli Whitney invented a machine that made the separating process automatic, Southern farming would change forever. Suddenly, cotton was affordable. Over the years, millions of bales of the fleecy staple have left the Delta for mills in the East and beyond. Today, about 10% of the cotton grown along the river is shipped from Greenville, Mississippi. Greenville sits in one of the best harbors on the river. This is an unusual place to find one of the most curious mysteries in the South.
Just north of town along the Great River Road sits Winterville Mounds. These large pyramid-shaped hills look strangely out of place here on the flat delta landscape. How did they get here? Why are they here, and how were they used?
The site was a ceremonial complex. At its height, it had about 35 mounds. There probably weren't but about 100 people living on the mounds themselves. They were supported by the villages surrounding the site. The villages could have been as far as 50 miles away. They came in once a year basically to have their big ceremonies. At that time, the mounds had structures on them, temples. They would burn the buildings, bring in more dirt, pack it down, and build another building on top of that.
It would have taken some 530,000 cubic yards of dirt and over 3 million man-hours to build a single mound. It's a tremendous feat in an age before mechanization.
From what we've been able to figure out, the women did the mound building. The men didn't build it. They were built basically with a basket that was about 4 inches deep by about 2.5, 3 feet in diameter. So it took a lot of dirt.
Archaeologists speculate that they were built by an advanced Coles Creek peoples who lived here more than 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, it was a real chauvinistic type society, more than likely, which has been that way in most any of these type of societies.
Of course, any guess as to why these mounds were made or who made them and how they were actually used is only that, a guess. We may never know for sure. So they stand here, a quiet, ghostly reminder of the past.
Since the days of the Coles Creek peoples, the wide, fertile Mississippi Delta has attracted settlers. The river made it easy to move, and the soil could grow just about anything. Facts that did not escape the Spanish explorers, and later the French who came here in the 1700s. Nowhere is that more evident than in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Historian Gordon Cotton.
If there had been no Mississippi River, there would be no Vicksburg. The river is the reason for our being. It was the reason for the choice of the spot where the city was founded, was laid out back in 1819. Again, it was going to be a mercantile center and an outlet for the cotton farmers, and it became cotton plantations in the area, and it was built on cotton, the cotton economy, the crops being sent down the Yazoo and down the Big Black and other streams into Vicksburg for export. And it really was a town that served, I believe, it was set up to serve the plantations with the mercantile interest. I think this is one of the things that made Vicksburg in the beginning, such a pro-Union town when the war between the states began, extremely pro-Union because of our commercial connections with the North. And these commercial connections were also family connections. And we were very reluctant to fight. All that changed once we got shot at. But it was a pro-Union town, and that river was the connection.
In the spring of 1863, Northern troops mounted a bitter 47-day siege of the city. Called the Battle of Vicksburg, it would turn out to be one of the most crucial battles of the Civil War. Today, over 500,000 people a year come to visit the fields where that battle took place.
If we can imbibe a sense of a person's heritage at Vicksburg, of where their forefathers fought and what they fought for, then we feel like we've accomplished our goal.
Bowie Lanford has been director of operations at the 1,800-acre military park, where granite monuments give silent homage to that bloody siege.
Well, actually, Vicksburg was the culmination of the Vicksburg campaign, which began in early spring of 1863, when Grant's Union forces crossed the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg at a place called Bruinsburg. There are a number of different modes of military operations that Grant used during the siege or the campaign of Vicksburg that hadn't been used before, or either hadn't been used to a great extent. Vicksburg was one of the first cities in the history of modern warfare to be under total siege, which meant that not only the military population was under siege, but also the civilian population was under siege. It was a port that was blockaded. The amphibious landings, one of the first amphibious landings took place at Vicksburg when Grant crossed the Mississippi from Hard Times Landing to Bruinsburg. Forced marches were part of Grant's plan of strategy to get to the scene of battles quickly, so that Pemberton, the Confederate commander, would not have time to defend them. Counterintelligence came into aspect with messages or couriers being intercepted by Union forces and that information being used to the detriment of Confederate forces. And finally, at Vicksburg, synchronized attacks all along the Confederate line took place on the final day of fighting there on May 23rd. Of course, they didn't have much outcome in the battle because they were repulsed by the Confederate defenders, but synchronized attacks were made on the Confederate forces.
In the end, Union troops would prevail at Vicksburg, and on July the 4th, 1863, the South surrendered. General Grant had successfully divided the South on these historic fields.
Today, the guns lay silent on the Vicksburg battlefield in memory of those who gave their lives in the war between the states.
Natchez, Mississippi sits high on a bluff overlooking the river. This is where more millionaires once lived than in any other city in America. So important was Natchez that Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, and Zachary Taylor were all said to have visited here. Bustling with business and pleasure, the wharf at Natchez under the Hill welcomed cotton-carrying steamboats and rickety rivercraft with equal fanfare. On the bluffs above, thriving shops offered the best quality goods from around the world, and the excitement would mount every time a whistle announced the approach of another steamboat.
The sight of a steamboat in Natchez is not all that rare, even today. Two of the last overnight steamers still traveling American waters tie up here on a regular basis, and the reception they receive when they do is probably about the same as it was a century and a half ago.
Natchez is a more sedate place now than during the heyday of the steamboat. It's better known for its rare collection of restored antebellum homes. Some of these mansions trace their history back to 1716, when the French first established Fort Rosalie on the cliffs overlooking the river. Dr. Thomas Gandy lives in one of those historic homes.
Farmland, the abundance of labor, and the combination of the developed cotton gin and the developed steamboat, all of these things, and the rich land, all these things came together during the 19th century to make Natchez what it was.
It was a flush era when planters built their opulent homes in town rather than out on their far-flung plantations.
They represent the expression of wealth from the cotton culture on plantations in the vicinity of Natchez. These were grand places. These were mansions, and all located on estates in and around Natchez. These estates had no other purpose than to just provide space for these homes. in that golden period when each house that was built was going to be grander and bigger than the last one that had been built. And the Stanton Hall was probably the final expression of that attitude.
Of the homes built here during its heyday, more than 500 still survive. Their new owners support the landmarks with annual pilgrimage tours, inviting anyone with the price of admission to have a look around. Some of them, like Stanton Hall, live on as bed and breakfast inns.
Perhaps the most interesting plantation home in Natchez lies hidden down a narrow country lane. This is Longwood. It has survived for more than 130 years now, even though it was never finished and never lived in. The 8-sided Oriental palace was designed by a Philadelphia architect for Haller Nutt, a wealthy cotton planter. The unorthodox design featured a 16-sided cupola, an onion-shaped Byzantine dome, when the home was begun in 1860. And for the first year, construction went well. The outside walls and dome had already been built by the time President Abraham Lincoln called all Yankees home to fight the Civil War. Unfortunately for Haller Nutt, the Pennsylvania artisans working on his mansion answered that call. They dropped their tools where they stood and headed north, never to return. Tools remain where they were left in 1861. A piano stands on its side, never uncrated. And now, tourists wonder at scaffolding that was meant for artisans who have long since passed into history.
South out of Natchez, and the landscape along the Mississippi changes. The flat delta farmlands that produce cotton, soybeans, and wheat up north gives way to rolling hills and forests that grow lumber. Logging trucks replace farm tractors along this stretch of the Great River Road. This is northern Louisiana, plantation country, the gateway to French Louisiana. It was here that many early planters decided to build their impressive antebellum homes, like the Myrtles, home of General David Bradford, leader of the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Cottage, home of Thomas Butler, a distinguished judge, planter, and U.S. congressman in the 1840s. And the historic Butler Greenwood plantation with its antebellum home that traces its roots back to the 1790s.
This was one of the first plantation homes ever built in Louisiana, Oakley House. And it sits in the middle of Oakley Plantation, part of a giant Spanish land grant made in 1796. The house itself was built amid tall oak trees and dripping moss in 1806. At its peak, it was the hub of a successful 3,000-acre cotton plantation.
Antebellum plantation homes in general probably represent, to a degree, roughly the same thing that, say, castles do in Europe. If that makes any sense, that would make them fascinating. They were the nerve center of a very large working area, as were castles. And of course, there are many similarities between the plantation life and medieval life in a castle with the peasants surrounding it and farming it and pretty much being in hock or owned by the fellow living in the castle.
Michael Howell is curator of the historic site, where we found archaeology students sifting through generations of debris, hoping to unearth clues to the past.
Oakley House here, for example, was built during what's called the Federal period, which was, again, that first awakening or flowering of an American character in regard to architecture. Well, the barn was one of the most important places on any farm or plantation. You had to have one. You couldn't run a farm or plantation without a barn or barns. I think they probably would have had several barns on a place this size. The kitchen here at Oakley is a detached kitchen, which was typical during the antebellum period, at least here in the South. Kitchens were considered a fire hazard, and with good reason. Most of the cooking was done over open fires. Very easy to get a grease fire started in a frying pan, for example, and there was no fire department around to call in those days. Hard to put a fire out once it got started. Also, from the southern climate standpoint, a kitchen in the house proper in the summertime would have been almost unbearable, as the heat is pretty bad anyway. Well, there certainly would have been a contrast between the persons that lived in the big house, Oakley House, so to speak, and those that lived in the quarters. The workday for people that lived in the quarters would have begun very early, around sunrise or so. They would have gotten up, made their breakfast, and then been called off to the work fields if they were employed in agriculture. Life in the big house, by comparison, would have been a little more comfortable, to say the least. But again, it was a busy place if you were doing your job.
One of the most famous people ever to have lived here came here to work. In 1821, a young naturalist by the name of John James Audubon was traveling the South, sketching the local wildlife. When he arrived at Oakley, he had run out of money and lived in a small room on the second floor of the main house. He divided his time between tutoring the young daughter of the plantation owner and sketching bird specimens from the area.
Audubon did do 32 of his bird studies during the time he was staying here at Oakley, and did 85 in this general vicinity over a period of several years. Some of his bird studies did create controversy or a stir in the scientific world about some of the poses that he put them into. In fact, there's still some debate over a few of the poses. But generally speaking, they seem to be pretty accurate. In fact, the birds as they're shown in the first edition bird prints are shown life-size, indicating that he was taking exact dimensions.
Some of the prints he created while he stayed here are still hung in the house today.
From Cairo to New Orleans, there are no less than 14 bridges that span the Mississippi River. But here in St. Francisville, there is no bridge. If you want to cross the river, there's a more interesting way to get to the other side, by boat. The motor ferry New Roads fills its decks with cars, trucks, motorcycles, well, anything with the toll, for a 15-minute crossing of the Mississippi. Here you can trade asphalt for the steel deck of the New Roads and enjoy a short break from your daily routine. This is not a trip for the novice driver, however, especially with a brand new car. But once you leave the levee, it's the nearest thing you'll find to a sea cruise in central Louisiana. All too soon, the landing at New Roads comes into sight, and it's back into Louisiana's plantation country.
Along the Mississippi from here to New Orleans, there are more than 40 great plantation houses that still stand, a tribute to the majestic antebellum period. Louisiana is a land of industrious people, and it has been since the first French Acadians settled the bayous of southern Louisiana in the 1700s. They had to be industrious to build such beauty on a hostile land that offered them little more than virgin swamp.
The Acadians lived a very natural life. They depended on where they settled. Did not allow them large farms and access to a great deal of farmland. They depended more upon the natural resources, the hunting, trapping, fishing, and they became quite adept at that.
John Dutton is curator of Louisiana's Rural Life Museum, where he and his associates have put together an impressive collection of artifacts from the pre-industrial South.
In any rural area, you would expect the families to be, and they were, very self-sufficient. You couldn't just rush out to the store and buy your bed clothing or any products in most cases. So frequently, if you wanted it then and there, you had to make do with what you had, and consequently, you would make your own clothing, your quilts and what have you. Most of the people lived out in the countryside, and many of them owned their own plots of land, worked those plots of land as you might expect a farmer to do. They may have owned a few slaves. In most cases, they worked right alongside the slaves if they had any.
And the crawfish hole that's being dug in the ground.
It was from these simple beginnings that the industrious Acadians built a great society along the banks of the river.
The Mississippi is now wide and slow-moving, as those droplets of water that trickled out of Lake Itasca 2 months earlier seem to sense that they are nearing the end of their journey. And, like us, they don't want it to end. New Orleans, the Big Easy, Crescent City. This is easily one of the most exotic cities in the world, where they celebrate life with music. They bury their dead above ground, and they play on a street called Bourbon.
Honeymoon couple here now.
Honeymoon.
Hey.
Honeymoon. Let's hear it for you.
Hey.
We are noted for our infamous 42-ounce porterhouse steak, built for two, unless you think you're the war. Pretty good, huh? Looks great. What is it? Drop it.
South from New Orleans and the final miles of the Great River Road follow Belle Chase Parkway out onto the broad alluvial plain of seagrass and marshlands, past Myrtle Grove, Port Sulphur, and Empire.
Fort Jackson has for decades stood at the mouth of the Great River as an outpost guardian. Her walls still stand a silent vigil as ships pass on their way to the sea.
Here, the Great River Road is paved with mussel shells, and strange and exotic birds soar overhead. The final settlement along the road before the mighty river empties itself into the Gulf is Venice, Louisiana.
There are no romantic Italian gondolas plying the canals of this Venice, only fishing boats back from a day's work in the Gulf, and drilling equipment destined for the offshore oil rigs.
There is little fanfare out here, no signs marking the Great River Road. Instead, the waters of the Mississippi lap ominously at its historic pavement. And soon, the road will disappear.
It is here on a narrow spit of land occupied by oil drilling equipment that the pavement simply ends.
The Great River Road, like the Mississippi itself, has come to the end of its journey, and so have we. Ahead lies the vast wetlands of southern Louisiana, and beyond, the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. For centuries, this has been a cradle of life. At one point, industry invaded, threatening to harm the environment and alter life here forever. Industry is still here, but its effects on the river have been greatly limited in recent years. Life as it was here is slowly coming back. I'm Loretta Young, and we hope you have enjoyed this look at an American tradition.